All right, this is part 2 of the Unit 2 EOC review. Part 2. More here than I expected. So, we talked about chemical bonds and things last time. And this one we're going to hit more of the macromolecules that made you guys love biology so much. Just a few things here. Make sure you understand the definitions of things like chemical reactions, just an interaction between chemicals. The importance of carbon in biological systems. Carbon is tetravalent. It has 4 electrons available in its outer shell for bonding, for covalent bonding. And so, you'll see carbon like this a lot, maybe some hydrogens or an oxygen or something like that. Um, and so that's important to know. Carbon is very important. It's not an organic molecule unless it has carbon, of course. There are some molecules that have carbon that aren't organic, but not very many. And then we talked also about ATP and the importance of ATP and how does ATP work. It's just ATP is a nitrogenous base like adenine in this case, a sugar, 5-carbon sugar, and these 3 phosphates. Well, the trick to ATP is the energy that is found in the bond between the second and third phosphate. And by breaking that bond, cells can do lots and lots of processes. Pretty much everything that goes on in your body requires ATP at one level or another in order to do some sort of work. And so ATP is extremely important. And I also want to spend a little bit of time talking about water. Now, water is this magical element that is extremely important in living things. Obviously, you can't live without water. And water has several things about it that make it very special. Water can exist in all 3 phases of matter naturally. You can go out and find water in all 3 phases naturally. Water is a polar molecule. Now, what does this mean? Well, if you remember earlier, we talked about how water has 10 electrons in it, because why is that? Well, the oxygen has 8 protons, and each hydrogen has 1 proton. And so those 10 protons come equipped with 10 electrons as well. And those 10 electrons are swarming around the molecule. And remember, we talked about how a covalent bonded molecule will share those electrons. Well, a polar molecule, if we say something has polarity, then there is an unequal sharing of those electrons. So how does that work itself out? Well, oxygen has 8 positives, whereas each hydrogen only has 1. Well, most of these electrons are going to love the fact that oxygen is so positive. And they're going to spend the majority of their time up here. Now, there may be the occasional electron to find its way around the hydrogen end of the water molecule, but most of the time, you're going to see something that looks like this. Now, remember, we have the electron cloud and that whole thing going, but this is an unequal sharing. Oxygen is getting most of the electrons, whereas hydrogen is staying positive most of the time because the electrons are not down there. So the oxygen end of this atom has a slightly negative charge, and the hydrogen end of this atom has a slightly positive charge. Now this creates a number of possibilities for the water molecule. Let's just look at a few. See if I can get my water molecule out of here. So here's our water molecule. One water molecule can actually form bonds, hydrogen bonds. Remember, hydrogen bonds are formed between polar molecules. One water molecule can actually form hydrogen bonds with 4 other water molecules. Now, what does that do? That creates a situation in which water does not readily let go of itself. And so we call water cohesive because it likes itself. It sticks to itself. We did a lab earlier this year where you just dropped water onto a penny, and some of you got like 50 drops of water on the penny. Why? Because water really loved itself and it didn't want to get over the side of that penny because of these hydrogen bonds. This also makes the boiling point of water very high compared to most molecules. Water boils at 100 degrees Celsius or 212 degrees Fahrenheit. And so water can store a tremendous amount of energy before it evaporates. This is why when you're really hot, you get rid of water because that's your body's quickest way to reduce your temperature. Well, water also is adhesive. Water is also adhesive, meaning that it sticks to other things as well. So water will stick to something like, say, glass. It will try to come up the side of a glass bottle, like when we use graduated cylinders, for instance. If you have something that looks like this, and we put water in that graduated cylinder, what happens? The water will actually ride up the side, barely, of that graduated cylinder to where you have something that's called a meniscus, because it's actually going up the side of the glass. If you've ever went to the doctor and they pricked your finger, they had this little glass tube, that has this nice glass tube here, and they stick that in there, and they don't suck it up with their mouth or anything. They just hold it up to the blood that they just got out of your finger, and what happens? Well, the blood goes right up inside of that tube because it likes the glass, but it also likes itself. So it's pulling itself up along the way. And so that action is called capillary action. This is how plants are able to pull water up from the ground because water is constantly being let go in the leaves. Remember, that's called transpiration, and water is being pulled up from the ground at the same time. Well, when water freezes, water will actually expand because the angle of the water, or the angles that water makes with one another, change, and so that causes water to expand, and that's why frozen water is less dense than liquid water. And so water is a pretty incredible substance, obviously very important in living systems, and we'll spend a lot of time talking about water in this class in one way or another. And water is important, and its polarity is important because of what it does to certain substances. Now, most of the time, or not most of the time, but sometimes when we mix things together, these things are not mixed evenly, or they're not dissolving or anything like that. And so what we normally call this is something like a mixture. A mixture is just a combination between two substances that are mixed together. I have a bowl of blue M&Ms, I have a bowl of green M&Ms, I mix them together, and I have a mixture of M&Ms. I walk outside and I breathe in the air. I'm breathing in a mixture of nitrogen and oxygen and carbon dioxide and other sorts of things. It's a mixture. Whereas a solution is a mixture in which the molecules are evenly distributed. And in a solution, which you have 2 parts. Solution. You have the solute and the solvent. The solute is the thing that is being dissolved. The thing that is being dissolved. And the solvent is the dissolving liquid. Now, this is where water comes in. Water is the universal solvent. it dissolves lots of things. Now, what sorts of things do you suppose that it readily dissolves? It dissolves things that are also polar. Like, for instance, remember earlier we talked about sodium chloride and the ionic bond that's formed there. Well, water, there's my trusty water molecule. Remember the negative end? Well, it loves that sodium, and it will easily surround that sodium molecule, just like so, until it's all around it. Well, the same thing will happen with this chlorine molecule, except you're going to have the hydrogens that are going to do that, and basically forms little shells around these ions and causes them to split apart. Same things happen with sugar, other types of molecules that readily dissolve in water. Now, nonpolar substances will not dissolve in water, like oil, for instance, will not dissolve in water. Now, a suspension is a mixture in which things are not evenly mixed together, and there's not dissolving happening. All right. Blood is a great example of a suspension. So if I have a jar of blood for whatever reason that I have a jar of blood, well, if it's all nice and even when I first have the jar of blood, later, maybe 24 hours later, I come back and check on my jar of blood, and what's going to happen is I'm going to notice that all the solid parts have sunk to the bottom and all of the liquid parts are normal at the top because they are suspended in that liquid temporarily, and once they're able to kind of dissolve down, then they separate. Like Italian dressing is a good example of this. Maybe that would have, a jar of Italian dressing would have been a better picture. Well, one more thing here. A colloid is just a more permanent suspension. Milk is a good example of a colloid. The fat in milk does not dissolve in water because it's not polar. Fat is hydrophobic or afraid of water, and so it doesn't dissolve. This is why when you go and you get your bottle of Nesquik from the gas station in the morning, your says on the side, shake well. Why? Because it's been sitting in that rack for a while, and you need to shake it to get everything nice and distributed, so your first drink doesn't taste watery, and your last drink doesn't taste extra good. All right. Now, one more thing about water. I'd hoped to get to micromolecules, and we might need another video here. All right. One more thing about water is that water will easily dissociate. Now, what does dissociation mean? Water dissociation means that it kind of comes apart, and it comes apart into two pieces here. And it comes apart into what's called a hydrogen ion. You can see that there. Hydrogen ion. And this ion, this OH negative, is called a hydroxide ion. And a hydroxide ion will dissociate from the hydrogen ion, and this is what creates acids and bases. A solution that has a high amount of hydrogen ions and a low amount of hydroxide ions is called an acid. The more acidic something is, the lower its pH will be. And the lower the pH, the more hydrogen ions that are in solution. Well, if we flip-flop this and we make hydrogen low and OH high, we no longer have an acid, but we have a base. And bases have really high pH. All right, and so some acids that you're familiar with are like hydrochloric acid, sulfuric acid, lemon juice, Coke, coffee. These things are acidic. And some bases that you're familiar with are things like bleach and ammonia and drain cleaner, which is extremely corrosive. All right, and what happens when you have an equal amount of hydrogen ions and hydroxide ions? Well, what do you think? It's all even its neutral pH at 7 is, so we go from extremely acidic down here at 1 pH, extremely basic at 14, and if H and OH are equal, then what do we have? We have H2O, or water. And this is a nice even pH. Now your body has a normal, pretty even pH around 7.4, but there are some areas of your body that are extremely acidic, and your body needs to deal with that, and that's where things called buffers come in. Buffers are just ways to deal with the acid that is in your stomach. For instance, your small intestine has a buffer that it releases called sodium bicarbonate, which we talked about in the digestive system. So next video, macromolecules.